It was the pogroms in Russia that drove the Jews of East Europe into the West End, and by the 1930s, this was an area, the West End of London was an area targeted by Sir Oswald Mosley and his black shirts, who themselves were modelled on Mussolini's Squadrismo. And on the 4th of October, 1936, just over 70 years ago now, the community in the West End, in the East End, was provoked. And the Jewish People's Council at the time presented a petition of 100,000 names to urge the Home Secretary to ban a proposed march by Mosley's black shirts. But the BUF had the support of the press and of the police, and with the Daily Mail running headlines in the 1930s such as "Hurrah for the black shirts" and ominously now, I think, "Put Britain first." The government failed to ban the march, and the people of the East End set about organising themselves to defend themselves. The Daily Worker called people out onto the street to block Mosley's passage, and the Jewish Chronicle warned readers to stay at home. The Communist Party directed its members to the Gardener's Corner in Aldgate, not far from the Tower of London, and 60,000 officers were assembled against between 100,000 and 300,000 people, mostly Jewish people, Irish dockers, trade unionists, socialists, communists, who gathered in the East End of London, determined to prevent the fascist march through the city's main Jewish neighbourhood. Barricades, including a bus and a tram, as well as trade unionists, stood on guard shouting, "You shall not pass!" a bit like Gandalf to the Balrog. And the community was ready. It was primed. It was ready to stop any mounted police or the fascists. Now, in the process of the Cable Street campaign, this clash, 79 people were arrested, many beaten. 6 fascists were arrested. Interesting that so few fascists were arrested, so many ordinary people. But eventually, the march was called off, probably because Oswald Mosley himself wanted to get on a plane to Germany, where the next day he was due to marry Diana Mitford in the home of Joseph Goebbels. But 5,000 black shirts of his British Union of Fascists were forced into a retreat. The police withdrew, and in 1976 a large mural was painted on St George's Town Hall to commemorate the event. The greatest anti-fascist victory on British soil, said David Olusoga, calling it a victory for the Jewish community, the people of the East End, and anti-fascists everywhere. It was here, the chief rabbi said, we learn the lesson of the power of unity. Jeremy Corbyn said, my mother stood in Cable Street alongside the Jewish people and the Irish people on Channel 4. On Channel 4, he testified that we all have a duty to oppose any kind of racism wherever it raises its head. He said the Cable Street defiance was of great personal significance to him, to his family. That was then. This is now. And I share the indignation of Gideon Falter, who last week was stopped in London on a Saturday afternoon and threatened with arrest simply because he, quote, looked Jewish and was in the vicinity of a Palestine protest march. Today he's written a column in the Times, and in it he gives more details. The more he says, the more incensed I am, and I'm sure the more shocked we all are at the attitude of the police to the events as it unfolded. This is something that requires outrage, and the expression of outrage. Gideon, he says he's a normal Londoner, out for a walk in his own city, and around him, while he was speaking to the police, were others chanting, "Scum, scum, scum," with their faces covered. They were not challenged by the police. Instead, he was told to leave to leave the area at a time when the Jewish community had been assured that there was no threat. They'd been assured by the police and by the government that London is not a no-go zone for the Jewish community. It's clearly, as he observed, it's clearly become a Jew-free zone. That's his words. It's simply intolerable. It's utterly reprehensible. One man is recorded saying to Gideon, and in front of the police, who did nothing to dissuade him from saying this, "I'm not afraid of your effing people. Wherever you go, I'm going to monitor and record your movements, not because I support you, but because I'm against you." Surely in any civilized society that is a threat. That is not the stuff of a legitimate protest. That is an anti-Semitic threat. It equates a man wearing a kippah, a Jewish man, with the Israeli assault on Gaza. It equates, it confuses being Jewish with being Israeli. It confuses being Jewish with being involved in the Gaza campaign. It attacks somebody for how they appear. This is anti-Semitic. This is fascistic. This is something from the 1930s. It's utterly intolerable that we can accept this could possibly be said in today's society. It's an anti-Semitic threat. And I disapprove of the Gaza campaign as it has played out. I disapprove absolutely with that campaign as it has played out. I disapprove of Netanyahu in the way he's carried out that campaign. But I certainly don't disapprove of Jews walking around in London. I don't disapprove of the state of Israel. And maybe I'm trying very hard to square the circle here. But I would make a very clear distinction between criticizing Netanyahu's policies, which I believe are wrong, and criticizing Israel, which I believe has a right to defend itself. I would make a clear distinction between criticizing Israel and criticizing my Jewish friends, or indeed my family. There's also arguably room for a further distinction between someone who is Jewish and someone who is Israeli, isn't there? There's a distinction. And swastikas on the streets of London, how can that be justified? The flags of terrorist organizations waved on the streets of London, how can that be condoned? And yet the person who is threatened by the police, who is threatened with arrest, is a Londoner who happens to be Jewish and who is not engaged in the march that is ongoing. He's told that he must know his presence is provocative. How? And later on, he was issued with an apology saying that being Jewish is not a provocation. Well, it's nice to know that. Gideon Falter has rightly called for Sir Mark Rowley, the head of the police, to resign. A policy of haranguing innocent people, whether because they are Jewish or because they are called Tommy Robinson, simply because they happen to be in the vicinity of a protest march, must be wrong. It must be wrong. Threatening people with arrest for looking Jewish, an appearance, is causing a breach of peace and is described as antagonizing. An appearance. This is a man who had no flag, who was waving no banner, who was not engaged with the protesters, or someone who had not spoken in public. He was simply targeted for wearing a kippah, for wearing a hat. I wear a hat. And sometimes my hat is from Israel. This hat happens to be from Georgia. The story, does it not? It recalls the Battle of Cable Street in 1936. when British Jews stood against the fascists and stood against the police, and both were made to retreat. I think this is a decisive and a significant moment which exposes something that is deeply wrong in our society, deeply wrong in the way our police are behaving. Yes, people have a right to protest. Yes, people have a right to protest, but it's the job of the police to protect them and to protect everyone else. That is the police's job. And to threaten people with arrest for simply being on the street, that isn't policing, that is thuggery, and that is fascism.